Welcome to the Collectability Podcast. Today, we are going to speak to the one and only Eric Wind, watch dealer, horological scholar, and former auction house specialist. Eric launched Wind Vintage in 2017, a company dedicated to offering exceptional vintage watches for sale, and at the same time advising some of the top vintage watch collectors around the globe. Eric has been featured and quoted in endless publications, including the New York Times, the New Yorker, FT, GQ, Robb Report, as well as Hodinkee. In fact, Eric was a contributor to Hodinkee going all the way back to the year 2010. Check out his writing on Hodinkee, including his comprehensive guide to watches that belong to U.S. presidents, as well as his detailed coverage of watch auctions. And that brings us to today's hot topic for the podcast. The title is Behind the Rostrum, the Inner Workings of the Watch Auction Industry. So welcome, Mr. Wind. How are you today?
Great. How about you, John?
I'm doing fine. And thank you so much for joining us. I've been looking forward to this one for a long time. So welcome to Collectability. Thank you.
If I could have 1 minute to just speak to the role that John Reardon has played in my life. We first met back in 2010 or 11 when you were at Sotheby's, and you were the most welcoming, gracious host. That was my first time at an auction preview in person. Ben Clymer and I went, and you were incredibly gracious and incredibly supportive. You gave me a copy of your book, Patek Philippe in America, Volume 1, and then you gave me also the reference guides, which I still have proudly in my office here. But quite frankly, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today without you, John. In 2014, Hodinkee was a part-time thing I was doing in evenings and weekends. You took over as international head of watches at Christie's, and you called me up and said, "Hey, would you be interested in joining the team? We've had a lot of turnover."
I remember that day.
And then you said it could only be a consulting job, not with benefits, but I'd love to have you. And I said, well, I've got a son who was just born a few months ago and got a wife, so I need health care. I can't just go it alone. And then we checked in every so often. I wrote about the Patek Philippe 175 auction at Christie's for Hodinkee. I went to the preview in Manhasset, and then, come 2015, you said, well, we've got the opportunity to have you as a full-time employee now. And it was the ride of a lifetime, and very grateful. Honestly, you've had, if I was to say in the world of watches, you've had one of the biggest impacts on my life. You and Ben Clymer, I would say, are probably the two most in terms of having an impact on my life. So thank you so much, John. And it really is an honor to be on your podcast.
Wow. Thank you so much, Eric, for those kind words. And the feeling is mutual. I mean, I feel like I've known you forever.
I feel, it's been 11 years, but it feels like 25 years, I think.
Delving into this topic about auctions I think it's emotional for both of us because it's an emotional industry. And we're going to have an open conversation now about that experience, what it was like working for the auction houses, the inner workings of the industry, the secrets, the gossip, the drama, the competition, the intrigue, the betrayal. Well, maybe not betrayal. It's not that dramatic, but maybe it is. So if you had to sum up the auction worlds in a few words, how would you describe it?
I think you actually said this, and I borrow it frequently, that it's like drinking from a fire hose, for those on the inside. And you and I both, I think, envisioned ourselves working for auction houses maybe until we retire, so that's been a big pivot in both our lives, but we would never look back. I mean, you and I both joke about what kind of number it would take for us to go back to auction, and it's a really big number. And even then, it's like we would probably walk away, even if someone threw some crazy number, because we actually get time with our family. We get to do what we want to do rather than having someone looking over our shoulder every 2 seconds. So in this regard, because I became a dealer a little bit before you. I was like, John, it's really nice on the other side. You gotta think about doing this. You won't regret it. And I'm happy to see that you're doing so well, and we do some business together as well. So it's great.
It's funny how life works that way and how friendship works. And you truly returned the favor and inspired me to go out on my own. And
yeah, it's great.
I was watching you closely, and as you watched Win Vintage and what it was like setting up a business. I mean, you've pivoted to entrepreneur very quickly, and that was incredible seeing you do that and build the empire that you have today. And
I'm just trying to be collectability now. You're the corporate.
Well, one thing's for sure, neither of us will ever be corporate.
Yeah, exactly.
And we probably sound like old timers now, talking about back in 2010. For many, that wasn't long ago at all. But
No.
for some coming to the watch world, that is the old days. And
Yep.
And that's why I think it's fun for us to share the story behind the story. So let's go back to when you started at auction. I mean, what was the market globally for watches at that point?
I was at Christie's from 2015 to late 2017 with you for the Geneva auction in May 2017. I think we had about 400-ish registered bidders at Christie's, and that included dealers, private collectors, institutions, such as the watch museums, et cetera. And going back this last year, the auction houses announced, including Phillips and Christie's, they had over 2,000, and I think Phillips had 2,400 registered bidders for their May auction last year. I don't even know, didn't see any information about that in the press release this year, but it's just incredible to think about 6x growth in a 3-year time span for registered bidders. So we're seeing, I think the decade that passed was a small number of people that really determined the market, just a few dealers in the US that would really participate at auction. And it was much smaller than now, where it's completely widespread. There's, a new dealer every minute on Instagram. All you need is a phone and an Instagram account, and you can become a dealer. It's really changed. And there's a lot more auction houses now. Any auction house can get registered and get on these platforms, whether it's Invaluable or Live Auctioneers. There's a lot of small auction houses that are getting into watches and doing really well. So it's, it just continues to boggle my mind how fast it's grown.
This market's changed so much in 10 years. In 20 years, it seems to be, it's a whole different universe. And then we go way back into the 90s, and it was completely different or before the age of the internet. But you just reminded me of conversations that we had attempting to persuade you to come into the auction world. Are you okay sharing with some of your concerns of before you went into auction?
Yeah. One of my concerns was that watches were my passion, and I just thought if I made it my full-time job, it might become a job, and like come 6 p.m. or whatever. In fact, it's not a 9 to 6 job, it's a 9 to midnight job. I spent a lot of days in the office in New York to midnight when we were finishing the catalogs and stuff. And my question was whether it would then become something that's like a duty, or you don't want to look at watches when you're striking out of work for the day. But I think it's the exact opposite. I mean, it's just the quest for knowledge is voracious. The hunt for the next great watch, it's constant. So it's fun to do it for yourself, like you and I are doing now as dealers, because we get to determine what we want to do each day and set the priorities for what we're doing. But it's constant, The excitement is even more so when you see something new and special you haven't seen before than in the past when everything's new.
Do you think the auction houses have changed their song in recruiting people from the time you were recruited until today? I mean, is it a different show? Is it a different pitch?
Yeah, I think it's different because there's a lot of changes, I would say, with auction house personnel. In the past, it was kind of homegrown, like when you were hired in the 90s. you start out, you might have some basic knowledge or aptitude or passion, and you really learn there. And now a lot of the higher level specialists coming in have been collecting for a while or writing, which is great. I mean, the people that you and I saw come in at sort of that junior trainee specialist kind of low level or as an administrator and then pivot to watches, only a small percentage of those people, I think, end up staying with watches. A lot of those people end up pivoting to other departments or leaving watches and, opening yoga studios or other things that we've seen people do that had aptitude and like some interest, but clearly not the passion. So the auction houses are recruiting people maybe from the world of watches, but maybe from other aspects of the world of watches, like writers or collectors and things like that.
If our friend, and I'm not going to reveal her name to protect the innocent, if she's listening, I just want to say you did the right thing opening a yoga studio. That was the best after auction pivot I've ever seen. And we're going to talk later about post auction lives, but we'll get to that soon. You touched upon how auction houses are structured. And I just wanted to, just for our audience, many know the big names that you see as the auctioneers out there, but there's this whole hierarchy within the auction world. And it's almost the same job descriptions within each company, each auction house. You typically start off as an administrator, which is how I started back in the day, where you're responsible for all the contracts, the paperwork, the shipping, the logistics. And to this day, I say that was the hardest job I've ever had. So to all the auction house administrators out there, we're thinking of you, especially during this very busy sales season. A job where every night you're working till midnight is brutal. And there were years you just don't have a day off, and 2 weeks of vacation if you're lucky, and even then you're working. So after that, you become a cataloger. What does a cataloger do, Eric?
They catalog the watches. So a watch comes in, they'll open it up. Say you have a Rolex Submariner in your hand. They'll open it, look at the caliber number, how many jewels, any information on the inside case back, and they're just initially doing the very bare bones, like bullet points of what the watch is, year, serial number, etc. And then they might go back and do a more detailed look of the parts, whether they're original, probably with the assistance of a senior specialist or above, and then a description, which we would divide amongst ourselves. Like, okay, you write these, I'll write these descriptions, and our deadline is two days from now, 5 p.m. We got to get this to the printer.
It reminds me of the day we're literally under the gun against the clock.
Yeah.
To write, and then it goes to print immediately. I mean, literally, it goes into print, barely time to proof, and that's very frightening.
Yes.
So catalogers, traditionally, that's where you kind of cut your teeth and really learn about watches. And it's a wonderful time to really study pieces when you're sitting at a tray of, in some cases, 20, 30 watches per day that you have to vet, research, and write about. And I have to say that is a beautiful part of this industry for the catalogers. It's difficult work, but that's when you're really connected to the property. And we'll talk about later, because once you kind of go up the ladder, you're not as connected to the watches as you might have earlier on in your career. So the next rung up the ladder is specialists. Depending on what country you're working or what house you're working, once you're a specialist, it's all about, you start as an AVP, then you go to a VP, and then an SVP. And it's people get very obsessed with these titles. What's the life of a specialist like?
Well, I think it's really, they care primarily the companies themselves. I tell people auction from the collector and dealer perspective is very different from auction within the auction house, where it's really a business and we got to hit our numbers. It's all about hitting the numbers every auction. And really what that's measured on is your sourcing ability rather than your selling ability, because the auction houses take the perspective that good property sells itself almost. So you don't really get rewarded for making that watch sell for 2x what it should have gone for, because they can't measure that. So yeah, I mean, it really comes down to like 3 words, as I say, source, research, and then sell. But you're primarily, from the business side, really rewarded on your ability to source, because you're researching and writing about it. That does help sell it. And then actually going and getting bids is critical, but it's not really something that they measure so easily.
It's a very interesting point you bring up. You're judged based on what you bring to the table in terms of hard numbers. And it could be based on certain pipelines and relationships you have with maybe dealers or certain collectors. And typically, the more time you put into the industry, the more of those pipeline relationships you have, which you protect at all costs.
Yeah.
And then let's say you do very well as a specialist. What's next for you? HOD, head of department.
You can speak to that.
So once you become a head of department, you're more of a manager. So you're managing the specialists, the catalogers, the admins. And this is where you take people that might be very strong with watches, and all of a sudden they're responsible for a group of people, which I think in every industry is a dangerous thing. Is you basically promote managers based on how they are as specialists, and sometimes the skill sets do not overlap, which leads to some very interesting historical leadership roles in the industry, which we won't be discussing.
You did a great job as head of department and head of watches, but you were almost always either managing down people that were wanting to leave or unhappy, and lots of internal squabbles, say in Geneva or other places, and then you were having to manage up to those above you to protect the department from cuts and all these other sorts of things. And I remember various times throughout the years you saying, I just wish I could get back to the watches. I just wish I could hold the watches more and spend more time researching them, because I'm spending every minute of every day on conference calls with someone, one of the other teams, or someone who's unhappy, or the management above. That was a constant battle when you're in that manager position.
The job truly, at least in my experience, pivoted from watches to people.
Yeah.
To human resources, to recruiting, to letting go.
Yes.
And it was that is very, very difficult balance. I think for anyone that has that role where their passion, it maybe turns into a nightmare. Not doing what not doing what you love doing, which the reason people are in this industry is because of their knowledge and passion and thirst for knowledge. So after HOD, you get promoted to IHOD, International Head of Department. Yeah. And then you're completely separate in many cases from your core love. So then there's the ecosystem around the department itself. There are business managers, which we're going to talk about very soon with their role within the auctions themselves. Business managers are kind of the pit bosses behind the curtain, who are really calling the shots regarding money. Because at the end of the day, it's about money. And then you have the executive team above you. And then that, once again, it's a business that's financially motivated. You also have regional offices around the world that you're working with. Some who still are great friends from different cities around the world. And the auction houses have sadly shut down. A lot of these regional offices are cut. And these are the individuals that literally have to do everything in a given city, from dealing with buyers, consignments, and we're talking all departments.
And logistics of shipping this stuff.
Unbelievably difficult job. A lot of respect there.
Yeah.
And then just a side note question. What was the perception of the watch department from other departments within the auction house, in your opinion?
It's hard to say. I mean, we actually, by percentage, were pretty much the most profitable department, but we weren't dealing with the big numbers of post-war art, things like that. So, I mean, you could say more than I could. I feel like, everyone got along with us and respected us, but I don't know if many really had an opinion.
What really pleased me with the evolution of the watch auction market is the respect that the watch departments are getting. There was a time not long ago that I don't want to name certain houses, but they were doing 10 million globally per year. And within 10 years, they were doing well over 100 million per year. And now we're seeing sales approaching that number, and we're seeing watch numbers moving towards art numbers. Still a lot of room for growth. But I think the level of respect towards the watch department has grown internally over the years from management and other departments. It was once considered, I remember I was in meetings with the head of the paperweight department, not joking. The paperweight department has since been closed.
That's amazing.
But yeah, I remember we had sales, this was pre-2000, that were not as strong as the paperweight sales. So there you go. That kind of says where the watch market was. And now look at it. It's just getting headlines in newspapers. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's insane.
All right. Now let's talk about the mechanics of an auction, how it all works, the nuts and bolts. And I remember as you were navigating this world for the first time as an insider, there were certain things that surprised and shocked you. And do you have any memories of those early sales and what you thought was happening around you, what you learned?
Well, I think it was maybe day 3 at Christie's. You and I flew to Hong Kong for the auction. My eyes were, I'm sure, looked like they're about 3 feet wide, looking at everything. It was my first time to Hong Kong. You had me under your wing and were showing me how to do things. And we're sitting in the interest meeting. And of course, those auctions, there's more vintage now than there was in the past. But at that time, 6 years ago, they were big auctions, like 400 lot auctions. They'd take 12 hours to do. You might have literally 2 vintage watches in the whole auction out of 400. So, and that's my passion. That's my forte, everything else. So we're sitting in the meeting with the Hong Kong team and they're like, Eric, can you bring bids on this like Long 1815? I had never sat in an interest meeting. And I think it's good that we discuss that because people don't know what that is. Essentially, as the auction approaches, you're having multiple meetings, looking at every single lot in the auction to see if you have people registered to bid on the phone. Because if they've gone through that effort, they probably will bid. If you have absentee bids, we're not allowed to know how high. But if they're absentee bids, maybe some auction houses let people look. I don't know, but you're not supposed to legally. So if there's absentee bids and other interest from client, you have a client who really wants this lot, has maybe looked at it, that sort of thing. And what it comes down to. And then you have the lots that we call uncovered, where there's no phone bids, there's no absentee, and it's, you're just going to see if it sells in the room or to someone online, basically. So our goal was really to get every lot covered and make sure it would sell as many as possible. And then obviously for the kind of key lots, make sure they're covered well so they get a lot of bids, particularly what we call cover lots, that literally the watches that are on the cover of the catalog or the back cover. That's the interest meeting that people don't see. That's really where you're meeting to make sure these things sell.
And during the interest meetings, during this era, you could predict how a sale was going to do. You had a pretty good feeling what was going to happen lot by lot. But now when you have 2,000 phone bidders and countless online bidders, I'm just speculating it might be more unpredictable in such a hot market that we're living through now. Yeah. I think more miracles might happen today than in the past.
Yes, yeah, exactly. No, I mean, then there would be lots where they're uncovered. If it's uncovered, you have then a couple choices. You can talk to the consignor and try to get them to lower the reserve. We sometimes had clients where we knew absolutely they would not lower the reserve. So you just try as best as possible to let them know it might not sell, so they're not ready to rip our head off after the auction. At least they know. But there's always the other aspect, which you and I talked about, is at the end of the auction, you're lucky if 1 out of 100 consignors is happy. People don't realize that. And you can have the lot sell for a record-breaking amount by 2x or 3x, and they're still unhappy and say it should have gone higher. It's sort of, as I like to say, the man's appetite is endless. So we can never be satisfied. Essentially, it's like the family crest for the Bond family for James Bond. It says the world is not enough. So that's kind of how many consigners feel. And you'll occasionally get that consigner who's thrilled and wants to take us out for lunch for the rest of our lives and those sorts of things. But it's the exception rather than the rule.
Oh, it's so rare. You get the complaints, but not the thank yous, because it's an auction. There's no cap of how well it could go. And also, the auction houses always hope for more too. I mean, that's just the nature of the beast.
Exactly.
Let's talk about estimates, which is a strange thing, especially in the world of vintage. With modern, it's easy to put estimates on a watch. It's commodity pricing. But what are your thoughts on estimates within the vintage watch world, past and present?
Someone asked me this recently about these teaser estimates that are kind of taking the world of auction by storm. Phillips is the master at the teaser estimate. So you'll have a watch that, say, should go for $100,000, and they might put it in at 15 to 25 or 20 to 30. And there's a lot of disagreement, I would say, in the collector community about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. There's a camp that strongly believes an estimate should be more realistic about what the actual value is, because you're trying to also give indications to people that don't know, that are trying to get involved in the world of watches. And for someone who's just getting into the world of watches, they don't understand, why is this 15 to 25 and it's selling for 100,000? And you say, well, that's the market price. And they said, well, if that's the market, doesn't the auction house know the market? That's their job to know the market. So I would lean more toward that camp. You want estimates that are more realistic a little bit, that help actually indicate some information, rather than just being ridiculously low. But the ridiculously low, the positives for the auction house are, one, they don't need to work at all to sell it. It's going to sell itself. You don't need to go try to find the bidders for it. Two, you get a ton more people registered thinking they're going to get a deal. And they love that. Obviously, people getting invested in the auction. And then three, in the press release, which I think silly, you can say the auction went, 500% above the mid-estimate value or whatever. And I think that's kind of a silly metric. I mean, it's just, if the things are estimated very low, then they're going to go high, It's just, they're going to go where the market is if it's a good watch. So that's the kind of estimates thing. And I tell people, and I think you do too, John, that the estimate, really the only data point that's useful is that the low estimate is the reserve. You could theoretically win the watch at that bid or below. So we had a lot when we were at Christie's. This gentleman had inherited a Jean-Claude Keeley Rolex, which has the calendar and chronograph. And he walked around to a couple dealers on 47th Street and they said the dial was fake. But it turned out it was a possibly unique dial with these gold circle hour markers. And he came to us at Christie's. We looked at it and said, I think it's real. And we came up with an estimate of $50,000 to $100,000, which was, to be fair, somewhat of a teaser estimate, but you never know exactly, because a mediocre one could be 80 or 100,000. You obviously always want to err on being on the low side. But he said, sure, but I'd like a reserve of 15,000, because I just want it to sell. I literally thought it was worthless and I was going to throw it away. And I really want to make sure it sells. So I remember in our interest meeting before the auction, the European team, when we said that the reserve was 15,000, they were all laughing. Like, why do you have the low estimate at 50,000, the reserve at 15? And it's because the client wanted that. And the watch ended up going for beyond what we could have hoped for, 499,000.
It's a thankless job. I want to reiterate the point that legally the reserve has to be at the low estimate or below. So that is a very important number to look at when you're looking through a catalog. High estimates, I can't emphasize enough, are just expressions of optimism. They shouldn't even bother putting high estimates in catalogs. They don't mean anything.
Yeah. Something that changed, I would say, when we were at Christie's, I helped push this a little bit, but I thought it helped get consignments. So in the past, typically the low estimate and the high estimate the difference might be 50%. So if you had that $50,000 reserve, you might have the high estimate at 70 or 80, somewhere in there. And then we began pushing about 6 years ago, why don't we say 50 to 100 and double the low estimate? And that sort of became widespread across the auction world, because you're then indicating to the consigner, particularly if it's a private person, it might go a lot higher. It might go to 100. So they're thinking about that number rather than the 50 to 70 or 50 to 80. And I always liked that, just doubling it, because the high number is a dream. It could go way beyond that. But now I've actually saw in this latest round of auctions, there was a lot at Christie's Geneva, and I saw other lots where the high estimate was more than twice the low estimate. So there was an AP that was 13 to 28,000, which is such a random estimate at Christie's Geneva. And I saw some others that way. That watch ended up going for over 100,000, by the way. But in reality, you don't need a high estimate, but it can help you get the consignment, because people think about that high number.
Because as a specialist, at first you're marketing to get consignments, and then you're marketing to sell said consignments.
Yeah.
And that's a good segue to the fees, the money. Recently, most major auction houses moved their buyer's premium from 25 to 26%. Essentially, it was like a COVID surcharge.
And there's some smaller auction houses that charge 30% buyer's premium.
It's steep. So,
yep.
So if the hammer price is 100,000, your invoice is going to be 126,000 plus taxes, et cetera. But then on the seller side, there's also selling commission, which is something that's not disclosed publicly. Everyone knows about the buyer's commission. No one knows about the seller's commission. It could average from 0% to 10%, even a little more, based on that consignment. The amount of money is being within that consignment. If it's a big estate, it's going to be one rate. If it's one watch, it'll be another. But I am always amazed the number of people after an auction that complain that they didn't know there'd be a buyer's premium. Did you have that experience?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. I mean, it's silly. We had dealers that you probably remember who bought watches in online auctions and then said they couldn't pay because they didn't know there was a buyer's premium. And we're like, you've been a dealer for 30 years, in New York. How is that news to you? And then they try to back out of the deal or negotiate it down, which we don't negotiate. The line at Christie's was that even if the Queen of England herself was buying a lot, she'd have to pay the full buyer's premium. There's no negotiating that down.
That is true. I mean, that number is sacred. But the selling side, it seems to be more of a conversation, which makes sense. There's flexibility and discussion.
Yeah.
Just a note, because it's interesting to see how other auction houses are functioning. I've always been a big fan of Jones and Horan in New Hampshire. They have no buyer's premium. So if the hammer price is 10,000, you pay 10,000, and they're charging commission to the seller on the selling side. So it's very transparent and always a pleasure to bid up there.
I think Patrizzi tried to do that with either Antiquorum or his own auction house as well, but it was very confusing to people because they didn't realize that. So people were always factoring in the buyer's premium when they were bidding, and then they weren't bidding as high because they were thinking it's going to be 25% more. So they abandoned that approach. But certainly we're all used to it and always factoring it in our bidding.
And now we're seeing more disruptors in the space, most notably and most recently, Loop This, and they have a 10% buyer's premium. What do you think of that as a competitive strategy?
I think it's great for buyers and sellers, because the idea is you get to take home more of what you would get. And it's because it's digital only, the mechanics of running the auction house are a lot fewer. I mean, you and I know we would see the millions of dollars Christie spends every year on catalogs to print them, ship them around the world. Obviously, all the physical locations, insurance, all of those things. And there have been many attempts, obviously, and there was a company called Paddle 8 that's out of business, Auctionata, more on the art side and other things like that. But to have serious watch auctions that are online only is relatively new. And now there's not just loop disc, there's double wrist auctions, there's dial and bezel, there's all these kind of watch only digital auction houses trying to form, which is interesting.
It's a new era, and there will be disruptors. There are disruptors, and I think the days of getting away with 37% commission on a transaction are behind us.
Yeah, I tell people, I mean, particularly if you have someone who maybe is an original owner of a Daytona, for instance, or they inherited it, if you have a watch that is going to sell for $100,000 hammer, the buyer will be paying $126,000 plus any applicable sales tax, shipping fees, etc. And the auction house might try to get him at 12% plus insurance plus photography, and he might be taking home like $87,000 out of a $126,000 transaction. So when there's something that has a real established market value, he's probably better off selling it, to a dealer like me or through a dealer, where that spread might be 10% or 15% instead of almost 40%.
And you'll also see the notorious success fee.
Yes.
So success fee, it could be at any break point, but let's say the estimate is 100 to 200,000. And if the hammer is at the high estimate or above, the auction house will take a percentage point or 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 on top of that amount. It's sometimes stepped, it's sometimes flat rate, but I'm just emphasizing, like, every deal is different, and the commission could be quite fat at times.
Yeah, that was relatively new 6 years ago, the whole success fee concept, and people got very offended by that, as you can imagine, as you know as well. But yeah, it was crazy.
I recently sold a piece, which will remain nameless, and was lucky enough that it hit the strike point to get the success fee. But when I finally received the settlement statement, that 2% really miffed me.
Yeah.
It's like, really? Seriously?
That's crazy. Yeah.
I mean, when you're making 30 points on a transaction and taking no financial position, I find it a bit steep. But
yeah.
On the other hand, that's the business, and we all make our choices with what contracts we sign. Point being, read the contracts, and if you don't want to, speak to someone who understands them that can help navigate those. All right, let's talk about the auctions themselves, which are, I think, what we most publicly see, what most people watch is the big show, and a great auction is so enjoyable to watch. We all agree. And we discussed what happens before an auction, how the specialists get the watches, how they vet the watches. Actually, can you comment on hilling sessions? That might not be a phrase everyone knows. Hilling sessions.
Hilling was about putting together the auction so you can try to hit that, $10 million per auction mark for New York or 20 million for Geneva, and trying to figure out what you have, what you could source that would complement maybe other things, what's hot in the market, which was very different today than then. When we did the Nautilus 40 in 2016, we had a hard time selling Nautilus watches.
40 Nautilus is too much.
40 spread over 4 auctions. People were like, this is just too much Nautilus, and we're getting Nautilus fatigue. So now any auction house would kill to have those 40 and then some. So that's hilling, but I'll let you add your 2 cents.
Wow. Hilling sessions. Yeah, I don't think we did like traditional hilling sessions when you were there. I'm kind of going back a bit further.
Yeah.
I'm not that old, but like 25 years ago, the way we did it, a healing session is you'd have a watch, put it in the center of a table. All the specialists would sit around, discuss the estimate. They'd discuss every last detail of the watch. It was a way to teach, almost apprentice the junior specialists of how to learn about those pieces. And I'm thinking back at Sotheby's. There was a gentleman by the name of Kevin Tierney, who was head of the silver department. And he was also the one that helped launch with Darren Schnipper, the proper watch department in the early 80s, because it was almost a spinoff from the silver department, because first it was pocket watches and then watches. So the traditional way of like teaching, this like master apprentice way of learning to be a specialist, was through these healing sessions.
Yeah. I guess it was just often just you and me looking at a watch, and you'd be like, okay, I was learning from you about it, and vice versa. So it was.
This is when the apprentice became the master.
No, at least with Rolex. But
that I agree with.
Yeah. But yeah, that it was more of a one-on-one thing. Like, what do you think the estimate should be? Let's look at it, etc. But yeah, we never did that formally with the whole department.
The idea of lotting a sale, I know you were part of that. Tell us about what that means.
I think that you compared it to an orchestra or a beautiful piece of music where you're trying to figure out a good flow and have different kind of high points, and then maybe go back to quiet moments. And, it wasn't, some auction houses just put everything almost by alphabetical order. I think every Rolex in order, every Gallet in order, etc. So with us, it was about trying to get a run of watches that would complement each other. And you don't want kind of two back-to-back symbol, clashes. For instance, you want to have a big lot kind of by itself and then a little quiet before and after. Then there's the infamous fizzler at the end, which I'd love for you to explain. The last lot.
It used to be the honor to have the last lot in the sale, because everyone there for the whole sale. But now I think, and this isn't true in every case, but in many cases, you put a piece that could do really well, or it might not.
Yeah,
that's lot, kind of the hanger, because it won't has no effect after the sale once the final hammer goes down or doesn't go down. So I find that very interesting. And I'd like to shout out to Rebecca Ross, who I think is the master of lotting a sale at Christie's New York. She put such attention to detail. Typically would spend 1 to 2 days really thinking through the ebb and flow of a sale. And I was always impressed how she did that. And she learned from Doug Escorbano, who is now at Phillips. And going back before that, I mean, there's so many people who we could mention who started traditions in the auction house that continue to this day. And I think we all have memories internally of how things are done, a certain ebb and flow of the business, a certain traditions. That's what it is. It's all about tradition. But it is tradition, and it might not be based in logic, but it is based in a little bit of common sense.
Yeah. One tradition that I kind of started at Christie's was that the first kind of 5 to 10 lots be super cool, under the radar, like no reserve brand, like chronographs, particularly from Universal Genève and Hoyer and other brands that were not Rolex and Patek Philippe, but a mix of other emerging things, often at no reserve. So people would get very excited. Like we put Abercrombie and Fitch by Hoyer, Seafarers, and things like that. And people always looked forward to those kind of first, 10 lots. It was fun.
Did you ever notice in a lot of the Hong Kong sales, it always starts with an hourglass?
Yes. Yeah. Every single one.
It's a tradition.
It's a tradition. Yeah. There were all those De Beers hourglasses that basically, they're kind of cheesy, but they
always sell very well.
They plug in and the diamonds like float around almost like a lava lamp. Mm-hmm. And that started when, like right before I joined Christie's, and it was because I guess someone had a ton of them and he just gave as consignments to every auction. I think at Christie's, they were like 10 at Christie's Hong Kong. And they're like, we're good for the next 10 auctions. They were literally sitting there. It was.
I'm disappointed if I don't see one as a lot one.
I think literally they were bought on closeout for a couple $100 each or something. And then, when they put one at auction and they went for like $10,000, and the guy's like, okay, you're good for the next like 10 years with these. I think they would literally had gone out of business.
Fantastic. Yeah. And ask any specialist the rituals ahead of an auction. They all have their various good luck charms or things that they do to prepare for an auction. Did you develop any of your own traditions ahead of a sale?
I wasn't really, but it was just following your lead. So you had every lot, you'd have a staff member like Mark, who the consignor was, in your catalog, like any details during our sessions. I did what you did, like, okay, we got 2 phones on it, etc. It was very important you have the copy of your physical catalog because there's state secrets in there, if you will, like who the consignor is. You don't want someone else grabbing your catalog and going off with it. You'd be in big trouble. But you had the lots kind of marked even by the consignor, I think, with Post-its sometimes. I tried to follow that because it's very helpful during the auction to know what's going to happen before it does.
And that reminds me, not naming which house. I never told you this, Eric. I asked one of the admins to overnight an old catalog from like 2002 to a client who just was missing it in their library.
Yeah.
And he or she overnighted the catalog that had the names of all the consigners and all the buyers, the reserves. Oh my God. Thankfully that person sent it back. But I think in today's, with data secrecy, it's probably not the best idea to walk around with those catalogs.
Yeah, exactly.
But wow. All right, let's talk about auction exhibitions, which is when everyone comes together. This is fun because right now I think of it so nostalgically, because I haven't been able to go to an auction for now seemingly 2 years.
You're making me miss auction a lot. I'm getting the crazy idea of going back to auction because of our conversation.
You may get 4 job offers after this podcast. We could auction off Eric Wind. Selectability will handle the transaction and charge
3-year contract. Exactly.
Ahead of an auction, there's an auction preview, usually 4 or 5 days. And this is where the community comes together: dealers, collectors, the auction house, the gallery assistants. And it's this part is quite special, I have to say. That part I very much miss. Can you talk about what these auction exhibitions are like and what the key players are actually doing at these exhibitions?
Yeah, I mean, that was also a lot of fun. We would put together the preview schedule, and certain times that preview would be dead, like Sunday mornings. We'd be lucky to see 1 or 2 people in there. And then other times you knew it was going to be very crowded, like a Saturday. You knew that tons of people were going to come in to look at watches. So you've got the kind of dealers that are coming in that might have a list of literally 50 watches that they want to look at. And the catalogs are getting marginally better with time, but the photos are not great in the catalog, and you can't really tell condition. You can't tell reloomed. You can request the condition report. So in advance of the preview, we would create these books, which Rebecca would do with obviously the condition reports of each watch that we would divide up. Also the certificate book, as it was called, where it'd have a copy of the certificate of origin or the extract from the archives for all of the watches as appropriate, and original guarantees for the watches, scans of them. So that was helpful because you would basically be looking at a watch, and then you'd have the condition report open. And I run into situations, it's about 50-50, I would say, where I look at a watch and agree with the condition report. I'd say 50% of the time, I think the condition reports are maybe too rosy. And there's the odd exception as well, where the condition report may say, case polished, and I'm very confident it's unpolished, or things like that. Then you've got the certificate book next to it too, so you could look at the original guarantee if it's a Rolex with the original guarantee. And then essentially you take notes for yourself and figure out, as it approaches, how high you want to bid. If you want to bid on it, if you want to bid in person or on the phone, you have to register, or bid online, which was, relatively new 6 years ago, the Christie's Live and everything else. Do you have a preferred sort of bidding method, John?
Being in the room is always best, but not always possible.
Yeah.
Phone bidding is also ideal, but not as good as being in the room. Leaving bids is a rookie mistake. Bidding online, if you have a lot of restraint in your DNA, it's so easy to keep clicking, and you can't cut increments.
Yes.
When you're bidding online.
That's one of the biggest issues. The other huge issue is, I'm sure you saw it 50 times. I saw it dozens of times, where someone's internet connection cuts out right before, or there's a problem with the Christie's Live system, like right as they're bidding, and everyone goes crazy. And you say, I'm sorry, it's too bad. It's sold. We can't reopen it. So it's it's tough.
It's also common. People will leave emergency bids with a phone bid. So if the phone can't get through, they'll bid on your behalf.
Yes.
In my experience, every time I left an emergency bid, they amazingly can't get through on the phone. I'm not judging, but you leave a fat bid, and if they can't get through to you, so you have some specialist bidding on your behalf with a nice number in front of them.
Yeah.
I think you just have to protect your self-interests when bidding, and do your homework, and ideally be in the room if possible, because you could pick up some great bargains too when you're in a room. Yeah. Auctioneers, well, we'll talk about auctioneers now too. They have a lot of freedom when they're up there in order to keep the sale moving, and sometimes they'll sell for tempting prices in order to move lots, especially on the lower end. So. Just a general question. Are auctioneers always department specialists?
No, not at all. As we saw at Christie's, I mean, their two auctioneers are both from the jewelry department now. Our friends Rahul and Max. So it's crazy.
I just shout out to them. I mean, Rahul did such an exceptional job at Only Watch. Yeah. I think he is one of the world's best auctioneers. I think. Yeah. He's right up there with Orel for putting on an auction experience that is entertaining and exciting. And I always loved going to auctions with Rahul, or watching auctions to this day with Orel. Yeah. You have any other favorite auctioneers out there today?
I mean, it's a mix. I'd say Rahul. I'm very excited. I don't know if you saw the Sotheby's Geneva auction, but Benoit Colson.
Yes, he took a few lots.
It was so great. And he's like, it's a beautiful bid for a beautiful watch, and it is beautifully sold. And he like brings the hammer down. It was the best. So, I think that's great. There's so many people that are so serious, which I can imagine, because you've got a lot of things in front of you. You're like a quarterback, or, it's more involved. It's like a quarterback rather than a conductor of a symphony, because the symphony is somewhat running itself. Here, you're the one that's making the decisions about what to do. Mm-hmm. And you've got the phone banks sometimes on both sides. You've got someone next to you with the bids in the book. You got people that have wildly different bidding styles ahead of you. Some people are like a church mouse. They're trying to do like this. And then you've got other people bidding and screaming and standing up and very aggressive. So, it's very interesting just what they have to do.
I love seeing a new crop of specialist auctioneers coming up the ranks. Like seeing like Marcello DeMarco out there as an auctioneer, where his enthusiasm and passion for each lot, he can't contain himself, and he's part of it. And he cares about each lot. And in each house has almost every house has a young specialist that's being trained to be an auctioneer, or is auctioneering already. And I'm glad to see that, because it's impossible to have a sale with someone at the front that doesn't they've never seen the watches, can't pronounce the brands or could care less.
Yeah.
Even though they're doing a favor to the department, it's not the same as having someone that's vested and interested in each piece.
My favorite kind of funny pronunciation story is Auctionata started, I want to say 7 or 8 years ago, and they had an auctioneer who was quite a character. But I think he was used to just being your typical auctioneer. I don't know if he was selling cattle or livestock or what, but he's like, next lot, we have a beautiful Rolex Daju. And he kept going on about Daju instead of Datejust. And I was rolling on the floor laughing. And Christine was going crazy too, because I was just so worked up. Like, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard.
That is classic.
Absolutely nuts, but that's what happens if someone doesn't know what they're trying to sell.
Well, Auctionata, may it rest in peace.
Yes.
So can you explain, and this might not be the politically correct term, but how is an auctioneer allowed to fake bid up to the reserve? And what is the correct description of that act?
Well, the chandelier bid.
Yes.
That's that's essentially like trying to get the room excited. And you're almost, for some of these lots where there isn't a bid, you're almost trying to trick someone into bidding, because they'll say that the lot is 50,000 is the reserve. They might say, okay, we can start the bidding at 30, 35, 40, 45. I have 48,000 or something like that. They might even say, I have. Can I hear 50? They'll go right up to the edge and looking for 50. It's with me at 48. And in fact, then it's like you're thinking it's going to sell at 48. And oftentimes consigners think that's a real bid at 48. And then they go pass. And then they go on to the next lot. And we dealt with this too when we were at Christie's, people saying, why didn't you sell it at 48? That's crazy. I would have been happy to sell it at 48 or whatever, lower the reserve. But you go like, that's not a real bid. That's that's just trying to get someone to entice them to bid the reserve. And, in this environment, obviously, when we're talking about teaser estimates and everything else, it's not as big a deal because it's such a hot market. Things are going to sell. But in a market where there aren't as many bidders and it's hard, you're really having to work to sell. And it was rare to have the so-called white glove sale where everything sells. In that environment, you had, 15% of the lots that might not sell. That was, in fact, our target at Christie's was they wanted 85% sell through. If you're getting higher sell through, that's great, but you're probably missing opportunities for reaches to make money, to find things that people are looking for. And if it's lower, you're doing a lot of work for the lots that don't sell, photography, the catalog. So when a lot doesn't sell, you're in fact losing money because of the effort that went into it and the shipping and insurance and all the other things. But you should be trying to reach toward, optimizing your revenue and profit.
I remember it was very pass fail. 80%, you're fine. Yeah. 79%, you're getting your throat slit that night. So watch yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
But I want to emphasize, because so few people understand or know this, that chandelier bidding is allowed by the industry. It's allowed legally. It's disclosed at the front of the sale. It's disclosed in the catalog that they are chandelier bidding, which is an 18th century term, lifting their hand towards the chandelier, pulling bids from the air, from nowhere.
Yeah.
And some auctioneers are masters of this, because you swear they're taking bids from the room. And when you're watching an auctioneer in person, it's really easy to distinguish when they're doing it. When you're watching online, impossible.
Yeah.
So when you're watching online, you would say that just there's other bids in the room, and that's their job. It's performance art.
Yeah.
And one of the things that now that I'm outside of the industry, I mean, I like to watch is when they chandelier bid above actual bids that would be in the room.
Yes.
You say the reserve's 100,000, and they go all the way up to like 95. There was someone in the room at 90, but they just chandelier bid to 95.
Yeah.
And then you watch them backtrack and be like, oh, well, maybe we'll take 90. and they'll go back down. And
Yes.
you would never pick this up because it's so fast and subtle. But it's one of the most enjoyable parts of watching an auction of what's happening. And your heart goes out to the auctioneers because their job is to sell, and it is not an easy job.
And two other things I think related to that. One, what is interesting, obviously, for both of us is that we were in the inside. So when we watch an auction, it's a completely different experience than if we hadn't been in auction, because we know, okay, these clients are with these phone bidders. This is what's exactly happening. And it's like, I think being a professional quarterback, understanding how the plays are going versus like just being an armchair Monday morning quarterback watching it and being like, they should have done this or whatever. But if you're the quarterback, you have a whole different experience level.
And that's another thing that's fun to watch in the auction room for insiders is the communication with the eyes between the auctioneer, the specialists, and the business managers.
Yes.
The power is with the business managers. They're the pit boss in a casino deciding on risk, deciding if they could accept a bid or not. And when you're watching an auction, you can very quickly figure out where the power in the room is. And it's not always with the auctioneer.
Exactly.
There were some auctioneers I remember they didn't care. They would take the missed reserves and just keep selling. The sale looked like it was going great. The specialists would be cheering them on because it's all good. The business managers would be flipping out.
They'd be red in the face.
Yeah, they'd pull the auctioneers and they'd get slapped in the wrist and life moves on. It wouldn't be asked again. It's such an exciting dynamic. And this is all happening when you're watching these auctions or participating.
Yeah. You're making me want to go back to auction, John. Now it's so funny.
I hear there are some job openings.
Yeah, exactly.
So when does title pass from the seller to the buyer?
I feel like that is when the hammer comes down.
Absolutely.
But unfortunately, there were many times, as you know, where things were not paid for. And
we're going to get to that.
Yeah.
Your favorite part of the job. But legally, title passes right when the hammer goes down. But sometimes the story just starts getting interesting at that point.
Yeah.
So we already discussed when the auction's over, what are the metrics of a success of the auction? But let's talk about the money and collecting payment. I recall this is the worst part of my job. You may agree it was the worst part of your job. Is the specialist role in collecting money.
Yeah, you feel like a debt collector, and you've got the consigners waiting on payment. And if someone didn't pay, you have to go back to the person who was the consigner and say, I'm very sorry, but it's unpaid and it's your property again, basically. And we can put it in the next auction or, let us know how to ship it back to you. And then people are not too happy, as you can imagine. The lot is essentially, you can go back to underbidders, try to get them to bid on it. And the auction house will take the hit basically on that difference. And oftentimes the item is kind of burned because it was supposed to be paid for and it was so publicly out there and then it wasn't paid for.
Oh, I'm getting stressed just thinking about this.
Yeah, now I don't want to work for an auction house after talking about that.
I've heard, and I don't want to minimize a very serious disorder that truly exists in the world today. So people may have said this lately, but I think it might also truly exist. Do you think there's a form, maybe a light form, we'll call it, of PTSD for former auction house employees?
There could be. I thought, if I think when I joined in 2015, your hair was almost pure brown, and by 2017 you had a lot of white hair in there. It helped you look more distinguished, but and maybe it helped you professionally, but I could just see the toll it was taking on you. And I was like, I can't continue. The stress was a lot. And I had, if you're sick, you could almost not recover because at least for me, like you're constantly working and pushing to excel. And we were really in what felt like, a war with the other auction houses. I think tensions were extremely high. push for consignments, it was competitive situations all the time with the other auction houses. And, it was just high blood pressure situation.
It's another story. We're gonna need like 3 hours for this chat today.
I tell people sometimes these, some elements of this stuff, and they say, you need to write a book about all this. And I said, well, then I'm not going to have a career if I do that. So.
Yeah, there's certain things you can't say.
No.
I'd like to play a little game, an auction house game that I like to call Secret Squiggly. I'm going to give you some marks that I found in auction house catalogs that have meanings. You have to tell me what they mean. And then I'm going to use some abbreviations, and you have to tell me what the abbreviations mean. Are you ready for it?
Sure.
All right. The first clue I have is NSV. What does that stand for?
Well, I think that was when we would get, for instance, a list of watches from an estate. I remember getting some of these sent over from Doug Escribano, and it'd be like these 10 watches. It'd be like, okay, this is NSV, this Hoyer, maybe the dial's reprinted or something, and it'd be no sale value. So it would be basically, it's not for us, is the term, not for us to sell at auction. And you just say, okay, send it to Jones and Horan, or put it at auction on eBay or something else.
The 1 for 1. Next one's tough. BI.
That is very, very funny term. Also, when I joined auction, it has to do with when a lot passes. And we say that lot BI'd, which isn't even really English, but it means it was bought in. And it had to do with the old time approach for the auction houses, where I think if it didn't sell, the auction house would basically be the owner of it rather than returning it. So it was bought in by the auction house, and it'd sit in some basement somewhere for who knows how long, until they decide to reoffer it again, and it's property of the auction house at that point. But yeah, it's just funny. The terms, there's not many BIs in this sale or things like that. It's just no one else knows what you're talking about.
This next one's tricky. IB.
Oh man, I don't.
We had very few of these, so I don't know if that's on the radar.
Yeah,
but that's an irrevocable bid.
Oh yes, yeah. We did. I don't think I saw one of those when I was at Christie's.
The next one, 3P.
3P.
Yes.
Third party guarantee. Yeah.
Third party, and for extra credit, Black Diamond.
Ooh, the Black Diamond. That's where the auction house makes a financial guarantee, right, on it?
No, that's a white triangle.
Yeah.
And just like a programming note, if you look, and I looked through some catalogs, I literally needed a loop
to see that.
The printing is so small.
Yep.
These secret squigglies are put in the catalog. They all convey very important information you need to know as a bidder, but nobody knows.
Yeah.
The Black Diamond represents 3P, which means third party guarantee.
Yep. Yes.
Means there's another individual who's already placed an IB, an irrevocable bid, on that piece and has a side deal going. This is all legit and allowed.
And that's what, say you have a client. We didn't do many of these, but it was becoming slightly more common, and I think was more common with other auction houses. But you say you have a 24.99 and it's got a $400,000 reserve. Say it's like a fourth series, and someone may want that watch, and say it's on the edge of selling, so roughly 500,000 after premium. You could have someone do an irrevocable bid, third party bid guarantee, where they will buy it at that price, 400,000 with premium. But if it sells above that, they get a percentage of the buyer's premium. That could be maybe as much as 10%. So in general, that's not how we operated at Christie's. We weren't really pushing those things, but the idea is that it allowed you to take risk, particularly with bigger lots where you have, and it's much more common in the art world, where someone may have a specialty in their collection in a certain artist, say Damien Hirst or something like that, and they have a massive amount of Hirst paintings and they want to support the market and make sure it doesn't pass, but they're very confident it will sell above that amount. So it's free money, essentially. They're just guaranteeing that it will sell. They're not putting up any money, but they obviously are liquid enough to do that. So it's become a kind of a favorite thing for hedge fund managers and others to do in the finance world, because it's another kind of financial instrument, as we say, where they can make money.
One needs to know what these secret squigglies are.
Yeah. I look for the symbols. If I see it in the catalog, then you go to the back and be like, okay, that's
every house has different shapes and colored. It's you need to just do your homework.
You and I both know then, okay, if it sells at the low estimate, someone else bought that who put up the third party guarantee when you see that happen.
Oh, it's complex stuff. All right, our next component is we're going to talk about, is there a life after auction? Mark Berliner, watch collector and all-around great guy, just posted on his Instagram yesterday that the actor-comedian Will Ferrell, he was part of Butterfield and Butterfields and listed in the jewelry and timepieces catalog in 1995. This was an auction house that was later purchased by Bonhams. And it's incredible to me to learn that Will Ferrell actually was in this world and in the appraisals department, no less, as his day job, as he was breaking through as an actor. So there is life after auction.
Yeah, there is.
Can you think off the top of your head other people that have left the auction world and other directions they've gone?
Yeah, there's a whole array, I guess, of us. It's interesting, like William Messina started Messina Lab and has, kind of facilitated all kinds of cool collaborations and watch designs. He previously was at Antiquorum. And we've got our friend who started a yoga studio. We've got all kinds of people who have gone on to do different things. It's interesting. There's not a lot of people that have done what we have done and gone from auction to the world of being a dealer. It's a bit of a risk. Obviously, we're gambling. We're, as you say, we're not getting the paycheck every 2 weeks or every month from the auction house for our work. We eat what we kill. So we have to go out and find good watches, and then we have families reliant on us doing well in terms of being able to buy and then sell for a little bit more than what we paid. That's the reality. And I think there's so many auction lifers just because it is somewhat of, there's a lot of adrenaline with the job. I remember you saying, I don't think we're ever going to leave auction, Eric. It's too addicting and too fun. but we both ended up leaving and not wanting to go back, thankfully. It wouldn't surprise me, in the coming years that we see more of the current specialists leave to become dealers or do other things. One of our former colleagues is now head of the heritage department at Tag Heuer. There's other opportunities to do things in the world of watches beyond the auction houses.
I think there is life after auction. So for anyone listening in the auction world, relish and enjoy every day, the highs and the lows. It is such a learning experience. And for some, it is a job to be a lifer for. For others, it's one other step in their career. All right, next question. In the global watch market today, what advantages do auction houses have? And then the follow-up is, what advantages do dealers have?
Yeah, there's pros and cons for both. For me, and I tell this to people, something that is unique, you and I can come up with our own values for what that is. That's truly unique in that definition of the word, one of one. Auction can help determine the value of that watch, if it's something special. So when we were at Christie's, there was a gentleman who had inherited a Rolex with a cloisonné enamel dial. That was kind of cool. It was kind of a red crest with fleur-de-lis and a knight's kind of helmet on it. And he offered it around to a few dealers. It was a 18 karat gold case. I think the best offer he got was $25,000. And we put it in, I don't remember the exact estimate, maybe 50 to 100, something like that. And it went for about 340,000 all in. So he was beyond thrilled. Also the Pearl of Bahrain that we sold there as well. It was, no one had seen anything like it, and it brought way above our estimate. So, those sorts of circumstances, it allows people to see something that hasn't been seen before in a global environment. Every serious watch collector and dealer is looking at the catalogs, and really the market gets to decide. It comes down to two people to determine that value. So that's an appropriate time to sell. I think when you have something that's very run of the mill with a very determined market value, it makes less sense to sell, because like I said, with that Daytona, most dealers say it sold for 100,000 hammer, 126 after premium. Maybe the real market's 120 or 115 to 120. And the dealer will give you 100, but in that case, you're netting like 87 if you're taking the full kit and caboodle of auction seller fees there. So you're giving up a lot. You're giving up maybe 6 to 7 months of time between when you can sign it versus when you're paid. And there's the risk that it doesn't get paid for. There's also the risk it gets damaged or stolen at auction, which we know about, unfortunately, particularly the damage side. And someone drops something, the dial cracks, etc. The auction house pays out at the mid estimate, and maybe it was going to sell for a lot more.
And I mean, there's certainly a community around the auctions because it is the public trading floor that's so visible.
Yeah.
And they do perform a magical role of bringing people together.
It's important. I always tell people I want auctions to do really well. That's really one of the only metrics we have and kind of real numbers we see as a community, even if the numbers aren't always real, if they're not paid for, but it really helps indicate momentum in the market, participation, excitement. It brings a lot of people into the world of watches. Mm-hmm. There are some people that you and I both know who basically only want to buy from auction ever. They'll never buy from you and me for whatever reason. They're just into the adrenaline. They think they're getting the best price, even though they're probably not. And they just like the whole atmosphere. And then separately, there's a whole group that never wants to participate in auction because it's too public. They don't want everyone knowing exactly what they paid for the watch on their wrist. They feel like they're going to get run up by the auction house to pay more than they should. And they prefer a more, direct approach with you or me or the countless other dealers out there. And then
there's the collector tire kickers that for 30 years go to every exhibition, looking at every watch. They've never bid, never will bid.
Yes.
But they're sitting there performing.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
That always drove me nuts. But now I can say that openly.
Yes. Yeah.
The auction specialists are there to sell, and I truly hope people go respect their time. And I think they're working, they're doing their best, and I know it's open to the public, but some people really take advantage of that too.
Yes. Yep.
And I can't emphasize enough as we wrap up. There are so many great people in this industry. Many are dear friends of ours. But like every industry, there's the good and there's the bad, but mostly good.
Yeah.
I think that, like you said, you might write a book about this someday.
I don't want to.
All right, we rephrase that. Somebody will write a book about this.
I'm sure. Yeah.
I think there'll be a movie about the watch auction business someday. So I'd like to know who is going to play Eric Wind in the movie.
I don't know. I don't know, and I hope it doesn't come to pass. I will just leave it.
I think you should play yourself, because the only person who could fill your shoes, Eric, is Eric.
Well, maybe my son Charlie could play me one day.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
But Oh, like the movie The Red Violin. There has to be a watch version of The Red Violin someday, and I can't wait for that to come out. And
yeah, and I mean, I think for those listening at home, we're only touching on 1% of the drama. The stuff we had to deal with, title issues where various people say they own a watch or stolen watches. It is like, telenovela or something like that. but it's real life. All I know is I'm really glad you were my boss, John, and I'm grateful that you taught me so much. And I was grateful that I worked for you and not for some others that are in the auction world. And I really, really appreciate everything you've done for me, John.
Thank you, Eric. It's an honor to call you a friend. And like I said, I feel like I've known you forever. And I hope this conversation helps shed light on an industry that we love and respect. And hopefully it could actually add some insight for people to ask the right questions before they bid. We hope this podcast can actually help people. And we want this industry to be a success. And a little transparency goes a long way.
Yeah. And last thing, I think the conversation that people got kind of a view into between you and me, people can basically theoretically access our knowledge. And clients ask me for advice all the time with stuff at auction. If they're clients of ours, they get the opportunity to really benefit from what we know prior to an auction. We can help them work through thinking about this lot that they're bidding on. Sometimes people don't want to ask. Obviously, they probably shouldn't be tire kickers and asking us for all our free advice. We both get that a lot, but on a positive front, like we have a plethora of knowledge that we can share with people to help them approach this in the most knowledgeable way before they embark on bidding, to assess the watch, to think about what's happening in the room as it comes up for sale. Rather than just blindly bidding. We see a lot more of what's going on in the shadows than any private individual would know otherwise.
I think that we are more than willing to assist those to ask the right questions to the auction specialist.
Yep.
About pieces that we might not have seen. There's certain things that you should always ask at auction.
Yep.
And there's always extra pictures. There's always a condition report. There's always little squiggly marks. You just need to know what to ask in order to be armed with all the information for the day that when you're bidding, and hopefully you'll bring home an incredible piece. And that's what it's all about at the end of the day. Our common passion.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eric, for your time. This was a pleasure and honor.
Awesome. Thank you, John. Take care.
This was the 9th episode in our Collectability podcast series. Thank you all for listening. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe. And remember to follow us on any podcast player that you enjoy listening to so you don't miss any future recordings. Thank you very much for listening. This is John Reardon for Collectability.